Once a group of young monks decided they must learn something hard-edged about this world people were always accusing them of running away from. So they marked off a small plot of land behind their monastery, not big, maybe 30 feet by 30 feet of ordinary ground. They still thought in inches, ounces, and feet. They shoved in a stake at each corner and ran a white string from stake to stake, delimiting the space for the eye, but leaving it open to the air, light, wind, and whatever walked or flew under or over the string. That's it. This was the origin of one of the most important experiments in the history of science. They decided they would see what would happen if they left it alone. What will the Earth do if we leave it alone? That was their question, and they proposed to answer it not by theory, but by intense, reverent, and sustained observation. All day, from light to dark, a rota of monks took turns at watching the square that had been marked out. Never were they to enter it, not for any reason. Every evening, the observing monk wrote up a log of what he had seen, mentioning all the plants in flower or in fall, all the creatures he had observed entering, leaving, flying over, browsing, nesting, resting, singing, whatever creatures took it in mind to do by themselves. What will it do with itself? Observation of the sacred garden became a basic task of the monastery, and it was a signal honor when a novice was deemed by the master of the novitiate to be observant and alert enough to be entrusted with membership in the Rota Hortensis, the staff of the garden. In fact, most of the monks who were watchers of the world, another name for the staff, were older, smart, knowing the names of many things. Year after year, the garden flourished and withered, dried out, boiled over with blossoms, was flooded with mud, hailed flat, Apriled back to life again. Long before the oldest of the Rota passed away, a regula or rule book had been written to secure uninterrupted perception of the garden and the even more vital task of protecting it from forces of destruction or innovation, which in this context were almost the same. As the garden began, so it had to go on. Fierce heretics arose who wanted to protect the garden by building walls around it, or by erecting a dome of glass and amber and precious stones over so holy a place, or delving a fosse around it, or a moat dappled with swans. It took all the holy efforts of skilled interpreters and all the energy of communal prayer to win through to a certainty that the first way was best: leave it alone. Leave it alone to leave it alone. Eventually, controversy died down, and generations of monks were content to observe, annotate, observe, record, reflect the events or non-events of the sacred garden inside its simple, shabby perimeter, whose cotton string was renewed every year on the 21st of July, feast of St. Arbogast the Irishman, Bishop of Strasbourg in Merovingian times, and called Hermit of the Sacred Forest. Nothing more. 900 square feet, 120 feet of string, 4 pinewood stakes, 1 monk, every day. Every year the annals of the garden were compiled, summarized every decade, published every century in full, with a digest of remarkable observations. Trees rose, trees fell. The mean temperature of the continent rose and fell. Comets scribbled in the sky and went away. Hurricanes came, droughts and floods and great winds, locusts, mice, moths. Several times the monastery itself was overrun by enemies of God or enemies of the state or starving peasants. And some of these times the garden too was bothered or violated. But that too, the monks reasoned, is just part of what happens. Let the garden take care of itself, they felt, and sometimes spoke. A few of them may even have thought, let the garden take care of us. The garden is strong, the garden is enduring, and it endures because it changes. Reflecting on this consoling but challenging fact, Brother Guido shielded his eyes from the rough October wind, and from inside his cowl noted the quiet agitation in the garden, the dried milkweed shivering its fluff under the wind's buffeting. He tried to keep track of the number of pods cracking open, but began to lose his way among the numbers. Counting always made him sleepy, an occupational hazard of those who tell their prayers on smooth-worn beads of horn or olive wood. He began to doze, struggling against it only a little, guessing reasonably that the precise number of milkweed pods, chivvied into generosity, is less important than wind blew, milkweed flew, which is all he would write down later in any case. As he faltered ever further along sleep's road, he began to follow the consolations of his belief. He began to allow the consolations of his belief to seep through his mind. He began to think about this garden, this very sacred garden he had spent so many years of his life observing with such care. He began to wonder if perhaps the garden is not the real garden after all, and maybe only that vast, frightening, and interminable world outside the little white stream was the real garden. And he and his mother and father and abbot and all his brethren and their sisters and cattle and flies on the wall and soldiers at the gate and lepers behind the hedge and harlots and scientists and ministers of state, yes, and the bishops and cardinals and the Pope himself, servant of the servants of God, and God himself, all of them, just what happened, would never stop happening, ever, to the most sacred garden. Almost all the way there, Brother Guido could feel himself shrink back from something that might be right or might be wrong, but something that did him no good to think. He woke, or almost woke, and a curious stillness looked into his garden and asked himself, "Where is the wind?"